Ever stood under a sky so wide your secrets felt small? Here on Cowboy Alec's Story, we ride the stories of the West Campfire Truth's trail dust memories. Saloon whispers, gritty humans sometimes messy. Every tale is a horizon to chase. Subscribe, pull up a stool, and maybe find a little courage for your own frontier. The train announced itself before anyone could see it, a long shudder through the rails that crept up the boards underfoot. Steam rose in a thin white column and spread into the pale sky. Mesquite Flats held still. A dog under the water tower pricked its ears. The crooked bell at San Miguel Church did not ring. When the engine hissed to a stop, dust lifted, caught the light, and settled on every face turned toward the platform. She stepped down from the third car, one hand on the rail, the other holding a letter softened by miles. Nora Mae Dalton. 18 maybe. Her dress had been mended with whatever was at hand. One shoulder seam pulled. The hem showed a line of uneven stitches. Her shoes had split at the toes. Purple bruises peered out where leather had given up. She carried a cracked wooden case that banged her shin every time she stopped. She looked for one face in a sea of hats. The letter had said he would be there. He had called her bright. He had written of a place with light and dry air and sun on a porch rail. He had not written about silence like this. At the far end, a man pulled his gloves snug. Arthur Bellamy. He wore a dark vest and a fresh collar. His boots shone even in this dust. He held a bouquet of white carnations stiff as paper. He saw her. He saw the patched dress and the case, the split shoes, the hands gone rough from travel. His eyes shifted. Something shut. "Arthur," she said, "barely more than the steam." He turned his head. The bouquet dropped to his side. He took one step back, then another. The crowd made space that became a path, and he was gone into it, the white flowers a last flicker before they vanished. Nora stopped moving. Her case tipped and spilled itself. A Bible with a softened spine thumped onto the boards. A bar of soap wrapped in muslin rolled against a boot. Two brass buttons struck the wood and spun. Blood touched the back of her heel and spread in a small red crescent. She sat. There was nowhere else to put the ache in her. People muttered without raising their voices. "Is that the letter girl?" Shame he did not even look. She looked starved. The station master cleared his throat and looked away. The dog under the tower lay down again and rested its head on its paws. A young cowboy leaned against a freight post near a stack of crates. He held a saddle under one arm as if it weighed nothing. Sun had burned his hair the color of straw. Dust sat in the creases at the corners of his eyes. Cole Maddox watched the way her shoulders tried to make themselves smaller. He had seen a shape like this, once white fabric, on a church step, and a woman who stood until the light changed, and still no one came. He lifted a wooden canteen from the freight cart and walked toward her with the patience he used on a skittish colt. He set the canteen on the plank beside her knee. He did not crouch all the way. He made himself slow. "What is your name?" he asked. She blinked, kept her eyes on the button by her toe. "Nora." He nodded. "Cole." He did not say, "I am sorry." He did not say anything about the man who had walked away. He held out the canteen. She took it and drank wrong, at first too fast, like a person who had saved the last swallow for too long. Water ran down her chin and drew a clean line through the dust on her throat. She wiped it with the back of her wrist and looked at him then. He did not look away. It felt like shade after empty noon. At the mouth of the alley, behind the mercantile, a slick hat brim appeared and vanished, the back of a vest. Cole noted it without turning his head. "Stand up if you can," he said. Nora put her weight to the boards, then flinched when the split leather pulled against skin. He offered his hand. She took it. Her fingers were cool. The edge of a callus had cracked on her thumb. When she stood, her case rocked against her shin again. The two buttons lay still between them. "Leave those," he said. "Nothing that small should keep you." A breath of wind pushed along the platform, warm and dry. It carried iron and coal smell and something sweet from the cafe and the copper tang of blood. A chime rang somewhere up the street. On the saloon porch, someone had strung a length of old spur rowels so they clicked against each other when the wind ran through. The sound crossed the distance like a thought. Cole listened to it, then looked at her shoes. "I do not have much," he said. "A handful of acres that will teach you how to work, a few horses, a roof that holds, a place for someone who got here the hard way." She looked down at her feet. Her toes had gone numb with the pain. She curled them anyway, an old habit that tried to make space where there was none. Her letter bent in her hand. She was not crying. She was tired in a way that was older than the trip. "Come with me," Cole said. "You can drink water that does not taste like iron. You can sit in a chair that was not bolted to a floor." She looked past him for one heartbeat. The alley held nothing a second time. The bouquet had not survived whatever walk it had taken. She could not find the white. "People will talk," she said. "They already did," he said. The platform cracked in the heat. The dog lifted its head again and watched them like it knew how a thing could change. Nora's fingers loosened on the letter. She folded it and slid it into the pocket at her hip. She bent for the case and closed it with a click. The brass buttons stayed where they were. She straightened and met his eyes. They were a gray that held blue only at the edges. She did not need to learn everything about a person today. "All right," she said. He lifted the saddle and moved with her off the platform past the freight scales and the bench where two gamblers had paused their game to stare. As they crossed the street, a child on the steps of the barber shop tracked Nora's broken shoes and then looked up at her face like he could not agree with both at once. A woman at the cafe window shook her head, but the hand holding her coffee did not stop. They reached the hitching rail. Cole's roan mare waited, one ear tilted toward them. He slung the saddle onto the horse's back with a soft thump. The leather smelled of oil and old sun. He tightened the cinch and checked it with a small tug. He did not rush her. He held the mare's head and let Nora put her foot in the stirrup and find the horn with her hand. "Swing up," he said. "I have you." She pulled lifted and missed once when her soul slipped. She tried again and this time found the seat. The world looked different from the height of a horse. It always did. Cole mounted behind her and set his hat back and gathered the reins. His knee pressed to the saddle and steadied them both. They moved down the street at a walk. Nora kept her eyes low until the edge of town. It was easier to study the shadows the porch rails threw across the dirt than to study faces. The sun threw heat at the back of her neck. Coal grit crunched under a wheel to their left. The wind chimes at the saloon sang again a high, quick clatter that sounded like someone making a small decision. At the last house, the road dropped. Shops gave way to mesquite and tall grass gone yellow. The country opened with a sense of relief, like a chest that had been bound and now could breathe. The land rolled out in soft, steady shoulders toward something that might be a line of cottonwoods. Heat lifted off the dirt in wavering lines. "You do not know me," she said after a while. "I know what it looks like when a person is left in a crowd," Cole said. "I know how heavy that gets." She held the saddle horn until her knuckles went white. She loosened her hands and then tightened them again because it felt worse to let go. They rode a little longer. A grasshopper sprang and hit the leg of Cole's boot and bounced away. Nora's heel stung every time the mare stepped down hard. She drew a breath and made her voice work. "Why would you help me?" she asked. He did not turn his head. "Because someone should have helped before now." She looked at his profile and saw a set of history in it. He had a thin white line just under his lower lip, a scar that must have been a boy's accident with a rope. His shirt had been washed until it had lost ambition to be any color but clean. A sprig of something dry and pale had caught in the saddle strings and rode with them. It looked like a bloom that had made a home without asking permission. Her foot slid in the stirrup when the pain bit too hard. She drew it back and tucked it against the skirts to protect it. The world pulsed once and steadied. He felt the movement. "There is water," he said. "A ditch up the road. The shade is good." They crested a small rise. The sound arrived before the sight, a soft run over stone that did not belong to this dry. Cottonwoods lifted their green and gathered the light into their leaves. The air cooled on her skin. "Hold on," he said. She did. They turned toward the line of trees, dust soft at their heels, the rowels in town still clicking for those who stayed to listen. The ditch spoke first, a soft rush over stones that thinned the heat. Cottonwoods leaned in and sifted the light onto their shoulders. Cole slid from the saddle and tied the mare where the grass grew taller, then came around and lifted Nora down as if weight did not matter. Her soles hit dirt, and pain flared bright along her heels. He steadied her with a hand at her elbow. "Sit there," he said, nodding at a flat rock by the water. "I have it." He set a small kettle on a ring of stones and struck a match. Smoke lifted. The water began to shiver. He opened his saddlebag and pulled out a clean rag, a small cake of lye soap, a tin cup. Nora watched his hands work. He did not look hurried. The shade smelled of damp bark and cool earth. Insects sang in the grass. He knelt. "I will take the shoes," he said, his voice careful. She gave a small nod. He loosened the knots and eased the torn leather away from skin. The air touched her raw places, and a breath escaped her throat before she could catch it. He dipped the rag in warm water and wrung it until it did not drip, then cleaned each heel and toe. He did not wince. He did not talk to fill space. The rag came back pink the first time, then lighter. "I am sorry," she said, and hated how it sounded. "You do not need to be," he said. He dabbed the soap once and rinsed it off so it would not sting. He wrapped each foot with a strip torn from a linen cloth he kept for such things and tied the ends on the top where the knots would not rub. She watched his fingers. There were small scars on the backs of his knuckles, faint lines from rope burn. His hands moved with the same care he had used on the horse. He gave her the tin cup, and she drank in slower sips until the hollow in her throat unclenched. Wind moved through the cottonwood leaves and made small coins of light on the water. She let her shoulders drop a little and felt the ache inside her rib cage shift to a quieter place. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and rose, and with a small hitch set the broken shoes beside her on the rock, as if they had earned a moment of rest. They rode again after the kettle cooled. The sun slipped west and left gold laying wide over the grass. When the country opened into a shallow valley, a cabin came into view, set a little uphill from a barn that leaned with intent. The roof was tight. The porch boards were scrubbed pale. From the eave hung a line of old spur rowels bound to a strip of leather. The wind found them, and they clicked soft and thin a music that belonged to this one strip of shade. "This is home," Cole said. Nora slid down from the mare and stood with her case in one hand, the letter in the other. The land felt quieter here. The air carried smoke and sun-warmed wood. Somewhere a rabbit broke from cover and went low through bunch grass. Cole pushed the door and stood aside for her to enter first. The room was one space with sense. A narrow bed against the far wall, a table with 2 chairs, a stove with a kettle already blackened from use. A plank shelf held a few bowls, a jar of coffee, a tin of salt. Everything clean and placed. A small cross of cedar twigs leaned above the bed, not nailed, only set there with care. "You can sit at the table," he said. "I will see to the mare." He left her in that light. The room took her in without question. She set the case on the floor by the table leg. She ran her thumb along the folded letter and put it away in her dress pocket. From the window she watched him brush the mare where sweat had dried. He worked with rhythm, slow pulls of the brush pauses for a palm along the neck. His hat brim cut a neat line over his brow. He looked like a man who spoke plain and laid things away when he was done with them. He came back with a tin of coffee and asked if she took sugar. She did not. He set 2 cups on the table and sat, but not opposite, rather at a corner where their knees would not knock. They drank. The coffee was hard and honest. It steadied her stomach. "You can have the bed," he said. "I will take the floor." "I can take the floor," she said quick. He shook his head. "I will be up before first light. The floor will not notice." He stood and reached for a folded quilt from a trunk. He laid it near the hearth and kept a pair of socks out rolled together. "Put these over the linen wraps. They are clean." She wanted to argue for the sake of pride, then saw his face and saved her breath. The thoughtfulness of the socks landed deeper than she expected. She took them and found they were soft and not tight at the toe. When she lay down that night, the bed did not creak. She stared at the ceiling boards and listened to the small noises of a person who knew how to be quiet. Outside, the roll chimes spoke once in a breeze, then settled. Morning came clean and quick. He put coffee on while she folded the quilt he had used. She swept the floor, even though there was nothing to gather. He said nothing about the way she did it. He saddled the roan in a smaller bay and set a second saddle a hole shorter. She watched the way he bridled with his hand under the jaw to keep the mouth easy. "Ride with me," he said. At first, her body fought the rhythm. Her knees wanted to grip, and her shoulders went tense. He rode beside her and said little. When she tilted forward too far on a downhill, he rode ahead and showed her with his own weight how to sit back. When she lost seat in a turn and slid to the side, he reached and caught the back of her belt and lifted. They stopped in a patch of soft sand where a fall would not break skin. He asked her to circle and change hands on the reins until the motion found her instead of the other way around. She fell once a slow tilt into sand that wiped dust across her cheek. She lay there surprised and then laughed a short sound, and the laugh loosened something inside her that had been tight for years. He offered a hand and did not pull until she set her feet. She climbed back on without a word. In the faint heat of late afternoon, they set the horses up and walked the fence line that ran along a wash. He carried a coil of hemp rope over his shoulder, the weight of it shapeable. He flicked the tail to show her how to send a loop under a board and draw it snug around a post. She tried and made a knot that would not hold, then tried again and felt the logic of it. The rope rasped her palm and left it warm. They sat on the porch when the day gentled. The light that came at that hour turned the yard into a patient thing. Cole rolled the rope back on itself and set it by the door. He said, as if talking about weather, that his mother came west young. She married a man who left. She scrubbed for miners and took in stitching. There was a time she boiled water every hour to keep from thinking about hunger. She was buried with no grave marker, just a stone, because wood did not last where men drank and forgot to honor it. Nora wrapped a mug of milk in both hands and listened. She knew how to hold a story without turning it toward herself. When he had said what he would, she said that some kinds of strong were not loud. He nodded once. It looked like he had waited to hear that sentence for a long time. The next day, after the horses were rubbed down, he asked her to come behind the barn. They walked through scrub to a thin fence that kept nothing but told you where to stop. Inside, a scatter of slender green sent up pale blooms night openers that held to late afternoon when shade was kind. He ran the backs of his fingers through petals and did not pick any. Evening primrose, he said. Started them last year. My mother had a fieldstone. I thought color would be better. Nora crouched and touched one bloom near the stem. The leaves trembled, not with fear, only with the breeze. The flowers had chosen to live where stones and dust tried to teach otherwise. She felt the sense of that in her chest. She said she had come from ashes and some days could still smell smoke. He did not ask what the fire had been. He stood beside her until both of them were calm. Clouds shouldered over the hills near sundown. Wind dropped and then turned. The first smell of rain arrived, mineral and wild. They were checking a western fence when thunder cracked crosswise behind them. Cole took her hand without ceremony. The horses tossed their heads. They ran for the barn at a steady lope that did not frighten the animals. They reached the open doors just as the sky let go. Rain hit the roof in a thick drum. Water sheeted off the edge and cut a line in the dirt. They stood under the awning, dripping breath visible in the cool. Nora pushed wet hair off her forehead. Cole shoved his hat back and looked at her. Their eyes met and held. He reached toward her cheek and stopped, not because he doubted, but because he understood the shape of patience. His hand fell and found the stall rail instead. The moment stayed between them the way A held note stays after the singer has turned away. Inside, they set the saddles on pegs and shook water from their sleeves over the doorway rather than on the floor. He lit a small fire and propped the door to pull in air. She brought him a tin cup of coffee, and his fingers brushed hers. The touch lasted a breath longer than it needed to. Days found a simple line and held it. She washed cups and learned where he stored things. He showed her a shed with neat stacks of old harness and a roll of stiff cowhide cracked at the edges and sound in the middle. She ran a thumb along an old stitch and felt the way thread and patience make a shape stronger than raw material. She did not say what she was thinking. He saw the look and left it alone. Her feet began to knit themselves back into one piece. The linen wraps came off, and the skin under them looked tender and new. She put the socks in a washpan with cool water and watched the dirt lift away. She hung them on a line and found it oddly satisfying to see them make a soft horizon across the yard. He took her into town once at midday to buy salt and coffee and nails. People looked because people do. Some kept their eyes kind, some did not. The rowel chimes on the saloon porch clicked in a breeze that cut straight down the street. A child pointed at her shoes without malice. She stepped around a broken board in the walkway like she had always known it was there. She carried the sack of nails to the horse herself. They rode home with the sun behind them, and the road quiet. At the top of the rise that overlooked the valley, Cole sat in the saddle and studied the far ridge. Nora followed his gaze. A thin smear of dust had lifted on the road that came in from the east. The wind was wrong for it to be cattle. The smear held and thickened. He did not say anything. He sat a little straighter, and his hand rested lightly near the horn. The mare pricked her ears forward. The evening primrose by the barn held pale in the lowering light. The rowel chimes at the eave made one clear click and then another. They eased the horses off the rise and down into the valley. The smear of dust on the eastern road held steady. Cole's mare felt it and set her ears forward. Nora kept her seat and let the reins lie quiet on the bay's neck. When they reached the yard, the wind chimes of spur rowels clicked, once then went still like a breath held. 3 riders came over the ridge at a trot. The lead man wore a black vest and pale gloves that had not met work. Arthur Bellamy. The 2 with him rode loose in the saddle, one long and narrow in the face, the other thick through the shoulders like a saloon bouncer. They pulled up 10 strides from the porch, and the horses blew through their nostrils and set dust to rise around their legs. Arthur swung down as if stepping into a courtroom. He took in the cabin, the barn, the rowel chimes, the horses still damp with sweat. His mouth made a small shape of disappointment. "So this is it," he said. "Not quite as your letters painted." Cole walked forward to stand at the edge of the porch. He did not look at the men behind Arthur. He set his weight on the boards the way a man stands a post during a storm. "You came far to say that," he said. Arthur took off his gloves and folded them. "I came to take back what is mine." Nora stepped out of the shadow of the doorway and came to stand beside Cole a half step back then forward, until they stood even. The yard smelled of hot leather and horse, and the green from the primrose bed behind the barn. Her heart had started a hard run, and she made it settle. "I am not yours," she said. "I do not belong to a letter." Arthur turned his head toward her in a quick slice. "You were nothing when I found you. A charity case with good handwriting. Every shop window in Mesquite Flats has heard the story now." Cole did not move, but the air around him felt tighter. "You left her at a train platform," he said. "You do not get to collect her now." "Out of my way," Arthur said. "No," Cole said. The long one on the left rolled his shoulder as if bored. The heavy one adjusted the bit on his horse and watched the porch. The sun was higher than it had been for work. It made a bright line on the edge of the pump handle. Arthur took 2 quick steps and put knuckles into Cole's jaw. The sound was small and sharp, a hollow crack against bone. Cole rocked back and found his feet. He did not raise his hands. Blood showed at the corner of his mouth. The rowel chimes spoke a thin answer and fell quiet. "Hit me," Arthur said. His voice had gone thin, too. "Go on." Cole stood. His breath came out and in. He did not set his fists. He watched Arthur's eyes as if keeping a frightened colt from breaking a fence. The second punch came from the side and caught his ribs. The pain made him bend an inch before he straightened against it. "Coward," Arthur said. Nora moved. She came down off the porch and stood between them. Her knees were not shaking. Her voice was level. "Enough," she said. "I am standing here because I chose to. I am not a debt. I am not a house to be reclaimed." Arthur's mouth thinned. "You made a fool of me." "You did that," she said. Cole's lip bled onto his chin and he wiped it with the back of his hand. He kept his eyes on Arthur. He did not reach for him. He did not step back either. "You will regret this," Arthur said. He lifted his gloves and shook dust from them and glanced at the men who had come with him. They did not look eager. The long one shifted in his saddle and studied the hills. The big one looked at the primrose bed as if flowers had no place here. Arthur put his foot in the stirrup and swung up. He looked down at Nora and let something cold show in his face. Then he turned the horse, and the 3 of them walked out of the yard and into the same piece of road that had brought them. The dust lay down behind them. The chimes let out a last thin click and went still. Nora let go of a breath she had not realized she was holding. She turned to Cole. The bruise under his eye had already begun to make its slow bloom. His breathing had a hitch in it now and then, like a board that had not been driven all the way home. "Sit," she said. "I am all right," he said, but let her take his arm and guide him to the porch. She fetched water and a clean cloth. He sat with shoulders set, and let her clean the cut at his mouth. The taste of iron was in the air. She dabbed along his cheekbone and watched the skin go from red to clean. "I brought this to your door," she said. The words were small and hard. "No," he said. "Trouble knows how to find a place. You brought other things." She looked at his face when he said it, and something inside her that had been braced loosened. She rinsed the cloth and wrung it again. The water in the basin ran pink and then clear. The wind shifted and brought the smell of damp earth from where the ditch ran under cottonwoods. In the barn, the roan mare stamped once and settled. A little later, she eased him inside and set him at the table. She lifted his shirt and checked for a deeper bruise. Her hands were careful and cool. There was a darkening along the ribs, but no wrong shape under skin. He touched her wrist and said he was fine, and she believed him until the next breath caught again. She made him drink water and then coffee because the day kept moving, no matter what was in it. At dusk, the yard took back its calm. The primrose opened the way it did, quiet and late. The chimes made a sound too soft to name. Cole lay by the hearth on the quilt he always used and slept with one arm over his eyes. She covered him to the shoulder without waking him. She stood a long time at the doorway and watched the sky give up light and find stars. Inside the cabin breathed the breaths of two people at rest. The kettle tapped once as it cooled on the stove. The cross of cedar twigs cast a small shadow on the wall, and then lost it when the moon changed place. The boards held the heat from the day and let it go in a slow tide. Nora sat at the table with the window cracked to the night and the letter in her pocket pressing the line of its fold into her thigh. She took the letter out and laid it flat. She did not open it. She set a smooth stone from the yard on top so it would not walk in the breeze. She listened to the crickets and to the way a horse chews in the dark. Her hands were steady. The room was so quiet she could hear her own pulse behind her ears. Morning slid in thin and pale. The first light turned the table edge into gold. The chimes spoke once and stopped. Cole pushed the blanket away and reached for his shirt, and the wince went through him again before his face smoothed. He came to the table and saw it. A folded page under a small stone. He stood still and looked at the careful square of paper as if he already knew what it might hold. Cole stood over the table and set his fingers on the stone as if checking a horse for heat. He slid it aside and lifted the letter. The fold had been pressed so neatly that the paper held the crease like a scar. He read without sitting. The words were careful. "Thank you for shelter. Trouble finds me. I fear I will leave your heart torn like the shoes I carried here. Forgive me." The door moved on its hinges when he pushed it. The chimes on the eave gave one light rattle. He crossed the yard and took the low trail east where the cottonwoods climbed out of the wash. He knew the path to San Gabriel the way a person knows the way to water. The sun had not climbed high yet. Light slanted through dust the wind had not bothered to carry away. The chapel sat where it always had half folded into the hill. The roofline had sagged and the bell was gone. Tall weeds leaned against adobe and made a sound like paper when the breeze passed. The door still swung and the floor still held. Inside, the windows were broken and the light fell in cracked lozenges, bright then dim as if the air kept changing its mind. Nora had set herself on the front pew, hands around her bag the way people hold a book they do not plan to read. Her shoes touched the floorboards. She did not turn when he stepped in. Boots on old wood sounded louder than they should. He stopped where the aisle widened and let the quiet settle. "I did not mean for you to follow," she said. She did not lift her head. "I thought leaving would make the hurt smaller." "If you are going to leave," he said, "do not take your shoes." That made her look up. Dust floated between them like ash that had not found a place to land. She waited. He came 2 steps closer and spoke again so there would be no mistake. "Leave them here," he said. "Let them keep this place. You walked into my life in those. They brought you farther than they had any right to." She watched his face. She saw he was not trying to hold her. He was trying to mark the ground so she would not forget where she had stood. "You are not afraid," she said, and heard the question in it. "Every day," he said, "not of you. I'm afraid of not seeing who you're going to be." He came and sat at the other end of the pew and let wood be the measure between them. She set the bag down. She took the letter from her pocket and opened it. She read one line and knew she did not need the rest. She began to tear it into smaller pieces, then smaller still. the scraps piled in her palm until they looked like dry snow. She let them fall to the floor. They did not make a sound when they landed. "I do not want to run any more," she said. "Then do not," he said. "I did not ask you to stay to save me. I asked because I saw something worth walking beside." She breathed and felt it reach places air had not touched in a long time. She slid forward on the bench and set her hands on her shoes. The leather had dried in ruts along the split at the toes. She loosened the laces and pulled the shoes free and set them together on the step below the altar. Her bare feet found the cool of the old boards. She stood a moment light on her shoulders and then went back to the pew and picked up her bag. They stepped outside. The sun had climbed, and the hill gave up a deeper heat. They walked in no hurry along the path that cut a line through brittle grass. The smell of cottonwood and wet earth came when they reached the wash. They crossed the yard with the sound of the rowel chimes thin behind the wind. The roan mare lifted her head to watch them, and then lowered it again. Inside the room felt like a place they had both chosen. Nora set her bag by the table and stood in the middle of the floor. She put her hand on the back of the nearest chair and held it until her fingers stopped shaking. Cole lit the stove with a match and did not ask any more questions. He set the kettle and stepped back. She went to the shed and found the roll of cowhide she had seen before. It was stiff at the edge and sound at the center. She carried it inside and spread it across the table. The smell rose the way dry rain does, sharp and warm. She took a length of chalk from a tin and marked shapes by eye. She cut with a knife he had kept oiled and clean. The blade went through with a steady pull and left a soft feather at the edge. Cole brought the lamp and set it where the light would fall even. He did not hover. He brought a small tin of needles and a spool of waxed thread and set them within reach. She did not look up. She hummed a tune that had no words and did not notice when she began. Her hands remembered the kind of work that keeps a person from thinking too hard. She pierced the leather with the awl and widened the holes until thread could find them. The needle went in, and the needle came back the sound small and sure. She drew the thread tight and watched the seam pull the two sides toward each other. She pricked her finger once, and a bead of blood rose bright and neat. She put it in her mouth and tasted iron and kept on. Outside, the afternoon slid toward the hour when the air turned softer. The chimes spoke to any wind that had not left for the day. Over the barn, evening primrose lifted its pale faces and held still. Inside, the first shoe began to find its shape under her hands. She bent close to see if the stitches lay even. She did not rush. The line needed to hold. She set the heel in her palm and tested the give. The leather answered with a low creak. Cole sat on the step and wiped dust from the saddle skirts with a brush. He looked in through the doorway now and then, not to check on her, but to know the room still held the sound of thread pulling home. He set the brush down and turned the saddle so the light could find a scuff he had missed. Lantern light met the first shadows. Nora tied a knot and pressed it flat with her thumb. She began the next row and followed the chalk line closely. The needle rose and fell. The leather warmed under her hand. The seam held. By dawn, the first shoe held its shape. Nora turned it in her hands and watched the seam catch light. She began the second while the lamp burned low and the sky moved from black to a washed gray. When she tied the last knot, she pressed it flat and trimmed the tail close. She set both shoes on the table side by side. They were not perfect twins. The toes did not match in spirit so much as in hope. She ran a thumb across the stitching and felt every choice she had made. Cole came in with the morning on his shoulders. He took off his hat and stood a step away. He did not reach for the shoes. He looked at them, then at her, then nodded once. The nod landed with a weight she could stand under. He smiled with his eyes and went to put coffee on. She slid her feet into the new leather. It was stiff and sure. The heels fit her cupped palms when she pressed down to test the hold. She stood, and the floor felt warmer. Work found them and filled the hours. They set a new rail on the north fence where the old one had gone soft. Cole showed her how to tow a post until it sank true. She found a rhythm for the hammer and learned the flat ring that meant the nail had seated well. They added a second stall in the barn with boards he had saved for years. He brought home 2 goats and a loose basket of young hens that scattered and then gathered around him like a spilled blessing. He said he had always wanted a noisy army to wake him before the sun could try. The hens proved him right. Nora learned to milk with patience for her own hands. Warm foam built against her knuckles, and the tin pail ticked softly under the metal stream. She laughed when a kid nibbled her skirt and pushed its small face away so it would not learn the wrong lesson. She washed shirts at the wash tub by the pump and stretched them on a line until they hung like flags of some quiet nation. She mended the elbows of his work shirt and tucked a small primrose inside the seam where only she would see it. Evenings were simpler than mornings. They ate at the table by the window. She set down bread from the Dutch oven and beans that had simmered on the back of the stove and the kind of apples that arrive in a barrel once a month. Cole cleaned his plate and did not comment on the food because praise was not a language he used lightly. He took the plates and washed them without being told. The rowel chimes answered small winds and fell quiet again. On nights when the stove had burned long and the room was warm through, they sat on the porch steps and let their knees touch without thinking about it. One afternoon, when the sun had not yet found its full heat, Nora heard a hammer on the far side of the cabin. She followed the sound and found Cole with a cedar plank propped on two sawhorses. He was carving letters with a chisel and a steady hand. The wood grain lifted in curls under his thumb as he cleared them away. He sanded and wiped and stepped back to look. "What will it say?" she asked. He lifted the plank and held it up to the eave lining it with where the studs ran under the boards. He drove 2 nails with measured strikes. The sign sat square and true. He stepped down and moved aside so she could read. "Embers and evening primroses, a place for the stubborn and brave." She brought her hand to her mouth the way a person does who has found a name they did not know they needed. She stepped close and traced the groove of each letter with a finger. The cedar smelled clean. She looked at him and he did not look away. He only said "for us," and the word had enough room in it for 2 people in a home. They wed behind the cabin on a morning poured out of gold. The sky began soft and held. Neighbors from 2 ranches over came with bread and pickles and a fiddle that knew all the songs. A schoolteacher from town brought a small book and a calm voice. Chairs had been borrowed, but most sat on split logs and did not mind it. The hens wandered the edges of things and clucked as if keeping their own counsel. Nora tied the last knot on a dress she had made in pieces. An old flannel patch lived along the waist. A bit of curtain hem curved into the skirt like a secret wave. She carried the shoes she had sewn and walked barefoot through new grass. The ground was cool. It told the truth. Cole waited with his hat pushed back and the clean shirt that held a crease along the collar. A child had tucked a yellow flower above his ear, and he had let it stay without arguing. When Nora reached him, he took her hands. He cleared his throat. His voice did not carry far and did not need to. "You came with shoes that had given all they could," he said. "You brought courage no man can trade for. I promise I will not let you walk alone." Her eyes held water that did not fall. She answered without a paper to read from. "You never treated me as weight. You saw me. I choose you today. I choose you each day that follows." The schoolteacher said the words that made it legal and then closed his book. Old Mr. Finch set the fiddle under his chin and found a tune that felt like shade after noon. They danced without steps. They turned, and the laugh in their throats shook loose whatever had not yet believed. When they kissed, it happened because both of them leaned at the same time, and it fit. Later, Cole cut the bread and handed the first slice to her. He stood with his back to the sign, and the light made a bright line around the letters. The rowel chimes clicked once and then gave up as if satisfied. The primrose behind the barn held its pale faces toward the last of the day. Seasons moved in their proper order. Grass went from green to straw and back again. Snow fell once and held the yard quiet for 3 days. The goats learned the sound of her step and lifted their heads when she came out. The hens made small comments about everything and still earned their keep. On the wall by the door below the sign, Cole nailed 2 pairs of shoes on a plank. One was small and new. The other was not. Its split toes had been mended with a strap of leather and time. He had found the old pair again on a slow day and brought them home without a word. Nora touched them each morning as she passed and felt both beginnings at once. Years put their polish on all it touched. A baby girl arrived and grew into the sling on Nora's shoulder and then into her own small boots. She slept with one hand near her mouth and a curl pressed to her temple, and woke with the clear cry of someone who trusts that answers exist. Cole watched them through the doorway when the light came early, and it stilled him in a way work never had. On a wind-clean afternoon, a wagon rolled slow on the road that cut across the front of the property. It eased to a stop beside the fence, and a girl climbed down. 17, maybe, thin in the way that says more about a life than a person should have to explain. She held a letter in her hand, folded so many times it had lost its corners. She looked toward the cabin and then at the sign. Her eyes moved to the shoes on the wall and stayed there as if they could tell a story faster than words. Nora stepped out with a dish towel in her hand and flour along her fingers. The child on her hip lifted a fist and reached for the light. The girl by the fence tensed, then tried to stand taller than she felt. "If you got this far," Nora said, "you already have what you need." Cole came to the doorway and rested his hand on the frame. He studied the girl in the even way he had once studied a stranger on a station platform. He nodded once. "We have room," he said. The girl looked at the letter and folded it in half again without opening it. She tucked it into her pocket and set a hand along the top board of the fence to steady herself. The wind came across the flats and pushed the grass into soft waves. It carried the smell of warm cedar and the dusty sweet of primrose. The roll chimes on the eave answered with a light clatter that sounded like home speaking under its breath. The sound crossed the yard and then floated out toward the road until it belonged to the quiet again. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story.